Well, it's really good to be with you. The title of this talk is Food, Population and Famine, Bengal 1943-44 and Bangladesh in 1974-75. There is a written version of this paper, which I hope you'll have access to. The key question approached in the paper is whether or not there were food availability declines, so-called fads, in each of these famines. And the paper takes as its background the work of Amartya Sen and his claim that fads were absent in these two famines. For example, he states of the Bengal famine that the fad approach can be firmly rejected. And in the case of the Bangladesh famine, he says, whatever it wasn't a fad famine. Now, this view that food availability declines were absent in these two famines, and indeed the generalization that they're often absent in famines, which has been made in some quarters, soon became and still remains quite widespread. You have a quotation here from Amrita Rangaswamy back in 1985. She says, in each of the famines he has analyzed, the Bengal, the Ethiopian, the Bangladesh, Sen has analyzed the crop data and established its irrelevance to the famine. And much more recently, Deval states, Sen showed empirically in 3 cases that famine had occurred without a decline in national level food availability, Bengal, Ethiopia, Bangladesh. So let's look first at Bengal. The background was obviously continued colonial rule and the fact of World War II. More immediately, there were a number of factors which conditioned circumstances. Inflationary pressures in the economy, the fall of Burma, a major cyclone disaster in October of that year, and then a fungal disease which hit the Amman rice crop, which was then responsible for roughly 70% of rice output. And the Amman crop obviously was usually harvested around December, the end of the year. Thus, Sen states that since the famine hit in 1943, it is quite natural, in view of the cyclone, flooding, fungus diseases, the disruption of the war, and the loss of Burma rice, that its primary cause should be seen in, and here he uses the words of the Famine Inquiry Commission's report, the serious shortage in the total supply of rice available for consumption in Bengal as compared with the total supply normally available. Having said that, however, for Sen, there was no food availability decline. He describes it as a boom famine related to powerful inflationary pressures in the economy. Indeed, quotes, food output did not fall very much anywhere and in general was quite high. Well, here are the statistics that he uses to support this claim. In column 1, we have the official estimates of rice production in Bengal. In column 2, we have adjustments to the official estimates. These adjustments were made by the Agricultural Department for the benefit of the Famine Inquiry Commission work. In column 3, we have some further adjustments made to the figures by Sen, for example, to include wheat and also to make some allowance for food movements. And finally, he indexes the per capita food grain availability figures on 1941. And he points out that in 1941, the value is only 100, whereas in 1943, it's 109. But of course, there was no famine in 1941. Well, there are several reasons to question the assertion that there was no food availability decline. The first is to point out that, in fact, the data are tentative. The Famine Inquiry Commission's report itself states, quotes, "As there are defects and gaps in the information available, any conclusions finally reached must necessarily be tentative." So any conclusion based on analysis of the data that SEN uses should at least be expressed with due caution. Secondly, in a paper published in 2007 in Modern Asian Studies by Islam, it is shown that the harvested area figures for 1938-41 were treated differently to those for 1942 and 1943. In other words, there is a discontinuity in the data that SEN is addressing. Now, the figures provided by Islam are given in columns 5 and 6 here. And again, the per capita availability figures have been indexed on 1941. But when this discontinuity is corrected, we now have lower per capita food availability in 1943 compared with 1941. Islam states in the paper, the shortfall in Oman production in 1943, actually late 1942, because the Oman harvest figures are counted in the next calendar year, the shortfall was not as moderate or indifferent as he, that is SEN, would have us believe. In addition, new data have arisen, in particular, new data on rice yields from 2 rice research stations. The data were unearthed by Taugo, but they first appeared in a paper published by S.Y. Padmanabhan, a distinguished Indian crops scientist, in the Annual Review of Phytopathology in 1973. And if you look at the yield losses exemplified here, I've selected data from his paper, you see massive losses. Now, we don't know how representative these two sets of data from rice research stations are, but nevertheless, they're indicative of a major failure in the rice crop. And Padmanabhan himself states that although the administrative failures were immediately responsible for this famine, the principal cause of the short crop production in 1942 was the epidemic of Helminthosporium oryzae. Nothing as devastating as the Bengal plant disease of 1942 has been recorded in plant pathological literature. Now, it's important to say that Padmanabhan worked in Bengal in 1943. So we have to give considerable weight to his statement. The final reason to doubt the claim that there was no food availability decline relates to the carryover stock of old rice that was available at the start of 1943. And there are good reasons to think that the level was particularly low. One of the Famine Inquiry Commission members, Afzal Hussain, felt extremely strongly on this, and he insisted upon publishing a minute as part of the report on the famine. In that minute, he notes that, quotes, from 1934 to 1941, there was no increase in rice production in Bengal, whereas the population had increased from 53 million in 1934 to 60.3 million by 1941. This much is certain, that Bengal had no carryover of rice worth considering in the beginning of 1943. So he's essentially saying that the carryover was substantially less than the report on Bengal was indicating. Also in this connection, Omkar Goswami has used the same data and sources analyzed by SEN to reconstruct the food grain stock, that is the carryover, and food availability figures for the period 1929 to 1943 on a detailed annual basis. And Goswami concludes food availability in 1943 was less than in 1941, contradicting Sen's claim, finding that fad could not have been very important. Now, still other scholars have come to the same conclusion. Balbrick, for example, you have the quotation here, and more recently, Cormac O'Grada's work published in 2008. He concludes that in Bengal in 1943, there was indeed a fad. So you have several analysts all coming to the same conclusion from different perspectives. Well, now I want to address the Bangladesh famine. Again, it was a very complex situation. The War of Independence, of course, occurred in 1971. The economic situation of the country in the early 1970s was dire. The country was highly dependent upon food imports. And then between July and September of 1974, there was very severe flooding, exceptional flooding, which directly damaged the Aus harvest of July to August and badly disrupted planting for the Aman harvest, the most important harvest, which, as we've seen, occurred around December. Food imports were also exceptionally low throughout 1974 and the first 4 months of 1975. Nevertheless, for Sen, there was no food availability decline. Indeed, quotes, rice output as well as food availability per head were higher than in any other year during 1971-75, and still the famine hit precisely in the peak availability year. Here again are the statistics that he uses to support this statement. And again, the figures for each calendar year include the Aman harvest of the previous year. On the far right-hand side, we have his indexed numbers, here indexed on 1971, and you can see that the value for 1974 is 107, implying that there was more food grain available per person in 1974 than in 1971. Again, there are strong reasons to doubt this claim that there was no fad. The first thing to point out, again, has been made very clearly by Elahi, and that is that the data have problems. He states that Sen's claim that there was no fad is both analytically and empirically weak. The quality of statistics used in the study is questionable. And Elahi observes that the figures that Sen cites, he does so without raising any question about their accuracy. Elahi also notes that the choice of 1971 as the base year for indexing is questionable. It was a time of conflict and particular disruption in the collection of agricultural data. If 1970, which was a much better crop year, had been used as the base, then the peak in 1974 would have been only a foothill. Even more important, I feel, is the fact that there are alternative statistical time series relating to this famine. Sen uses data drawn from a book by Alamgir, and Sen's analysis is presented on a calendar year basis, carrying through the Aman harvest statistics at the end of a given calendar year into the next year. But columns 5 and 6, shown below, show different time series figures on food grain availability. These statistics are provided by Ahmad and also used the same numbers by Jovan, and Muqtada and Basu also make reference to some of these numbers. Like much of the data on this famine, The figures relate to 12-month periods, I suspect from July to June, which bridge 2 consecutive years. So these years are given in column of 4 of this table, 1970, 71, 71, 72, etc. We then have the net availability figures provided by Ahmed. They are then put on a per capita basis in column 6, and then I have indexed them on the values for 1970-71 in column 7. And what you see is a very different picture of what may have happened in Bangladesh in the early 1970s. The figures fall away, and the figure for 1974-75 is just 91. It is slightly higher, admittedly, than the figure for 1971-72 of 88, but the figures for 1971-72 are, as Ahmed notes, highly controversial. Now, using the alternative statistics, Basu concludes that the argument of Sen that the total availability of food in the year of the famine was not far from normal cannot be true. And other writers, Martin Ravalion, for example, has also suggested that there may have been a small fad during this famine. Basu's statement raises an important question, and that is, when did this famine actually occur? Now, in this context, Sen states that, quotes, the food output in Bangladesh did, of course, go down as a result of the floods of between July and September 1974, when the Amman crop was harvested around November 1974 to January 75. But by then, the famine was largely over, emphasis added. So he sees the famine as being largely confined to the calendar year 1974. But that's a rather unusual view. A more common view, I think, is that the famine extended over much of both 1974 and 1975, a period which might indeed be better labeled 1974-75. So here are 2 sets of data which provide insights on this. Unfortunately, the death data here only relates to the MATLAB area, which of course does not necessarily reflect Bangladesh as a whole, although the data are high quality data. And what you see is deaths increasing throughout the second part of 1974, but remaining high in 1975. Indeed, the peak occurs in the first half of 1975, and it then slowly falls off. The price data, which do relate to the whole of Bangladesh, show a steep increase in the second half of 1974, following the flooding, but then the price stays high. Again, it peaks in early 1975. So both of these time series suggest that this famine was not largely over in 1974. It extended through much of 1974, and indeed, certainly the first part of 1975. So to conclude, there's no firm basis to reject the occurrence of a food availability decline in this famine in Bangladesh. Indeed, the alternative food availability figures that we have just considered suggest that 1974-75 was indeed a year of unusually low food availability. Remember, the index value was just 91. Moreover, locating the crisis in 1974-75 also chimes much better with the available information on food prices and deaths. Now, I'm coming near to the conclusion, but I'll just make a few additional points. The first is that, of course, the causes of both these disasters were complex. In neither case can their genesis simply be attributed to a food availability decline. That said, however, the evidence points reasonably strongly to the fact that there were fads in both cases. Secondly, a famine in Ethiopia was mentioned at the outset of this presentation, and the claim that there was no fad in that Ethiopian famine has also been challenged by several authors. Sen shows little sign of changing his mind in several publications. He still thinks there were no food availability declines. Nevertheless, a general issue is why the contributory role of food availability declines in famine causation is so widely downplayed, often with negligible attention to contrary research findings. And on this final question, I'll make 5 main points. The first is that, of course, most people they don't have the time to directly examine the data themselves. And I suppose we all have a tendency to accept what is being claimed in publications. Moreover, the more something is published, the more it tends to be accepted as true. So there can be a snowball effect, effectively. Secondly, the denial of food availability declines means that the discussion of famine causation inevitably focuses on distributional issues. Now, distributional issues are certainly very important. However, I think that it's convenient for many analysts, certainly in the field of development studies, because they feel more comfortable in addressing issues of distribution as opposed to issues of shortage. Related to that, the rejection of food availability decline can be seen as consistent with having an anti-Malthusian perspective, although even Malthus acknowledged that food declines could happen for other reasons, reasons other than his population theory. The claim that a famine occurred without a fad, while obviously not impossible, can be seen as being somewhat counterintuitive, that is, contradicting what is commonly thought by the layperson in the street. So it may also have the psychological benefit of helping some social scientists in their conviction of their own discipline. And then linked to some extent to that, ideas which are seen as true but counterintuitive exert a special fascination, or they certainly can. In this context, the early Christian theologian Tertullian has stated that its very improbability makes it believable. And I think some people believe in famines occurring without food availability declines, almost on a faith basis. To conclude, if there is a general conclusion from this talk, it's that evidence should always be approached with caution. As Bill Brass used to say, data should always be treated as guilty until proven innocent. Here are the references that have been cited in this presentation. Thank you for listening.
Good afternoon, Tim. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry there's some mix-up. Shri just called me to say that I'm late. I don't know, there was some mix-up with the timing. But you have heard Tim. Well, Tim has been a very dear colleague. I had the privilege of working with him for almost 30 years now. Tim is one of those few demographers who has been working on India for almost close to half a century. And we remember him in India, especially because he has been using the vital statistics, the civil registration data to unearth India's demographic past and to some extent demographic future. As a matter of fact, he has written 50,000 years of Indian demographic history, among others, of his very notable citations, etc. So, Tim, it has been a pleasure going through your paper. I'm pretty sure there are some questions to be asked, but largely you have questioned the conclusions to be drawn based on incomplete data. And that is something which I think all statisticians, demographers, social scientists need to have a hard look at that. Are we carried away by certain emotions, certain preconceived notions, or there's something much more to that, etc. And what are the message are we sending when the data is incomplete? So I think that's a very important message Tim has tried to convey both in his written paper and in his address now. Well, Tim, among other things, you have also seen the Indian food situation. You wrote a paper, a book for FAO on India. I would request you if you could throw some light, because I remember when we were at the LSE, you were sponsored to look at India's population and the growth of the food grains, etc. And how do you see, there are two major revolutions in independent India. One is the Green Revolution led by none other than the great scientist, Dr. Swaminathan, following the India-Pakistan war. And the preceding to that history is the Public Law 480 India had in the 1960s with the US, when India imported huge quantities of wheat, actually. And that was followed by the then Prime Minister, Jai Jawan, Jai Kisan, Lal Bahadur Shastri. So these are very important things when you look into how independent India has looked at shortage of food as such. The second is the White Revolution, which is in terms of the cooperatives in the milk sector, the Amul experiment, which Dr. Varghese started in 1950s, and India is now among the largest producer of milk, which is also a supplement to food. So that's something very important. And the third point I would like to request you is about the Maharashtra. It's not exactly a famine, but it was a drought area, as we call it, 1972 to 1974. 3 years Maharashtra, the state I come from in my civil service career, had also this whole issue about shortage of food. There were failure of rains, and Maharashtra came up with something which was unique in that part and that time, etc., which was the employment guarantee scheme, which means that the government would provide people with work in their own villages within 8 kilometers, against which obviously they would not only be given wages, but they were given food, which was, I think, quite a remarkable thing, looking into all the famine issues which we have seen. And that 3 years scarcity in Maharashtra did not result into some excessive deaths to the extent what we have seen, which was, say, 30 years from the Bengal famine. So these 3 quick things to Tim for his response, if you would like to, at this point in time, while we wait for our other participants. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. To you, Tim.
You can hear me now.
Yeah.
Yeah, Giant, it's lovely to see you. It's really lovely to see you. Thanks for doing this. Just to run through a few of the things that you talked about. One is, yeah, sure, a fundamental. I finished off with a quote from Bill Brass, who was president of the IUSSP and was an incredible man. And the importance of data. I think demographers were pretty good at this, but in some other areas of social science, without mentioning any, they're less cautious, if you like to put it that way. So that is, data should always be treated as guilty unless proven innocent. I think as demographers, we're okay on that, but it's not always exhibited by by all scholars. The work that I did on food prospects in India with Amresh Hanchate, yeah, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that the situation is massively different. Other than the exception of the issue of climate change, and incidentally, I'm talking about that in a session tomorrow, there's just hugely greater stability in terms of food supplies. Milk, you mentioned milk consumption. It's at staggeringly high levels, or at least it was. I'm a bit out of touch on the details here, but milk consumption was at incredibly high levels in some parts of the country. And again, I'm out of touch, but at the same time, levels of meat consumption, and in some of the official statistics, meat consumption involves fish, it incorporates fish, was incredibly low. And I suspect, although I am out of touch, that levels of in inverted commas, meat consumption in India remain exceptionally low, although, as I've said, milk consumption is incredibly high. Another feature, going back to the general work on the future of Indian agriculture that Amresh and I talked about, related to nitrogen fertilizers. And again, I haven't looked at the data in any detail recently. I would be very surprised. At the time, there was certainly a continual upward march in the application of nitrogen fertilizers. And in a sense, there has to be. Well, that's a positive thing. Now, to come back to the two crises that you mentioned, one is Bihar and the other is Maharashtra. And of course, with Maharatna, I did some work on this. There's actually relatively little emphasis, relatively little data to suggest that there was substantial excess mortality in Bihar in the mid-1960s. Now, the data are extremely poor, so that point has to be underlined. But nevertheless, in as much as we could use them, we found virtually no evidence of any significant excess mortality in Bihar in the mid-1960s. And as I think, Giant, you pointed out, that partly reflected the massive export to India of wheat from the US, or at least I'm fairly sure it did, although there were lots of bottlenecks in getting that wheat into Bihar. Maharashtra, 1972-73, I think it was a relative success. There was excess mortality, and both the SRS and the vital registration data that you referred to are suggestive that there was excess mortality. Arup and I suggested that it was, this is of course a rough figure, perhaps 130,000 excess deaths. But on the other side, that's in a population that was something like 50 million. And it's a figure that is split over 2 years, 1972 and 1973. And in addition, I think there's no doubt that some of those 130,000 excess deaths were immigrants, particularly from Madhya Pradesh. So, and it was a very severe drought. And world food conditions at that time were extremely tough. So I think it was a relative success in terms of famine prevention. And I accept the conclusion of Jean Drèze. Drèze argued that it was an example, and largely the government of Maharashtra, I assume, is the agent here, of getting relief supplies to the right people at the right time in the right places. So if he came to that conclusion, I think I can only support him in that. So those would be my comments, Giant, to what you said.
Thanks, Tim. I'll come back to your response, and maybe other people may also join on the employment guarantee scheme. It was structured, but right now we have the discussion. Mr. Chinmay Tumbe. Mr. Tumbe, you are listening? Yeah, good. So Chinmay.
My sincere apologies. Yes, thank you for this kind invitation. I'm a sincere apologies. I've marked it on a wrong day, but I have read it in advance, so I have everything out here with me.
So
firstly, it's a
we
great...
are waiting for you now. Kindly carry out with your discussion.
Sure. Yeah. What I will do is I will offer some comments based on what I've read, and then open it out for questions. I understand a lot of people also want to ask questions. This is a great privilege to be in conversation out here with Professor Tim Dyson, whose work I think all of us have read tremendously. And since I have been working on mortality events of influenza and a variety of events of the past, this is of obviously great importance. I found the write-up very interesting, especially given the conventional wisdom of, when we say conventional wisdom, I think it's the wisdom of the last 30 years, which has really placed the Sen's argument of distribution rather than production at the hem of many famines. What I will do is I will show you just 3 or 4 charts to kind of place Professor Dyson's very thought-provoking work, especially in the Bengal famine, more than the one on Bangladesh. So I'm just going to share a couple of charts. Yeah, can you see this? Right. So these are a bunch of charts from a working paper of mine called Pandemics and Historical Mortality in India. But just to give a sense of the Bengal famine and to place it in the wider context of that time. Tirthankar Roy recently makes a very important distinction between a food famine and a water famine. I think it's a very important part of looking at famines in South Asian history. It's just a paper. I think he's written 2 papers, one in the EPW and one in the Journal of Interdisciplinary History. Both have come out in the last 3 months. And the idea that water famines, in a way, the basic distinction, as in, we forget that a famine is not just about not having food, but often you don't have drinking water. A simple idea, but one which has kind of been lost in this vast literature on famines in South Asian history. And that if you see this chart, the big shocks of India, 1877, 1899, and 1918, the one in 1918, which are, really, these are all India kind of figures, z-scores, average of z-scores across regions. So that's what this chart is showing you. And so the 3 worst all India droughts in Indian history, monsoon failures, all happened in in the late 19th and early 20th century. And the reason I'm showing this chart is because the period in the build up to the Bengal famine is very peculiar in India's rainfall history. That is, this is India's golden 25-year run stretch, where actually India suffered no major droughts going into the 1940s. So in the 1920s, in fact, the census official in 1931 said, the 1920s are a great period because there was no drought. I mean, virtually what was known in the meteorological circles, it was considered to be an outlier. And so was the 1930s. So if you see this chart between 1920 and 1940, there's really nothing serious happening in terms of water scarcity. And I think that's an important point to kind of bridge what Professor Dyson is saying, because going into the 1940s, the idea of uncertainty in food production had, in my view, at least when we look at both output data as well as rainfall data, kind of diminished, which also means that in the past, while people had kept a lot of buffer stocks in response to climatic variation, which people themselves had seen, at the end of the day, the way farmers were producing is a bit of not much of official data, but what they themselves had seen in their lifetimes. And leading up to the 1940s, you suddenly had a generation of people who had actually not seen serious rainfall failures for more than 20 years, a unique aspect in Indian history. And that is why I think the buffer stock levels in 1940s were much reduced at a very household or farm peasant level across India. And given the fact that the rains really, in one Eastern India was really hit in the early 1940s, this could be one reason why food production, not only food production, but buffer stocks. I think that's the key element. One is food production, buffer stocks, and then imports. And buffer stocks can be through imports, but buffer stocks can also be from past harvests. And I think the key element is what's happening in the Bengal famine, which is very tough to estimate, is what is happening with buffer stocks. And why is it that the reliance on imports from Burma, various other places, why did that, did that really shoot up? And B, what really happened to buffer stocks in the years leading up to 1940? I think this can potentially explain some part of that puzzle. That is, farmers in general were living in relatively prosperous times in terms of rainfall. Of course, they were economically hit in the Great Depression and so on. So that's one comment I had about this idea. Again, it's interesting because the water famine had kind of disappeared. And it had not really, was probably the last time a water famine was really experienced was in 1899. But the food famine, I think, also had this element of relative certainty leading up to the events of the 1940s, which then changed. I'll now scroll to some charts on rice prices just to give a sense of a long-term picture on what's happening. Look at figure 7.2, which is on inflation from 1864 to 1939. Now, this is in the lead up again to the Bengal famine. The worst years being 1918, 1919, along the time of a drought plus influenza. But you'll see what happens in 1940s is again a dislocation. You can't see it in this chart, but I'm just trying to give you a sense. These are the major provinces of India. Synchronized movements which change broadly in a short period in 1920. But in the 1940s, from what I gather from Professor Dyson's work, from what I've also been looking at the price data closely, there does seem to be a substantial disruption. The last time such a massive disruption happened was in 1918-19 during influenza, where the synchronization of inflation across India kind of breaks down. In 1918-19, for example, you had deflation for 1 year. In 1918, you had deflation in Eastern India and 30% inflation in Punjab. Now, these kind of extreme price movements, again, the context was war back then, World War I, railways disruption. I think that's an important aspect of the disruption to price movements, which has kind of been understated in the literature. That is the significance of the railways diversion. Much of the Bengal famine literature focus on steamboats and Burma, but I think the railways shutting down is also an important aspect of that story. And finally, coming just to this idea of how big are these shocks? A lot of these numbers come from Professor Dyson's work and various other estimates. The Bengal famine, for example, is placed here, 1943-42, 2 to 3 million. This is again from Professor Dyson's work. But if you see, in the larger range of famines, this was a concentrated famine, which again, compared to the devastating famines of the late 19th century, was much lower in scale and much more kind of, concentrated. And I think a part of that, again, comes down to this argument of the food famine versus the water famine. I think by the early 20th century, most parts of India had kind of figured out how to stop water famines. Cholera was also a concomitant kind of a disease burden, which kind of was reduced in huge extents in many parts. And I think that's also an additional point to make out here, that in the context of the Bengal famine, the mortality, while we say excess mortality concentrated in Bengal, compared to the famines of the past, I do think the intensity was also much lesser, though devastating in a particular region. But the fact that the famine didn't really, extend beyond that particular region is also, in my view, a very unspoken or an important question to ask as to why was it so localized by then, especially because we don't really see serious famines between 1918 and 1940s. So those are some thoughts on the Bengal famine. I don't want to take too much time. On Bangladesh, unfortunately, I'm not an expert on that particular demography, so I won't comment much more beyond that. But these are some thoughts I had, and I think with that, I think Professor Dyson can maybe also share his thoughts about how he sees these differences between A, the buffer stock idea, B, the idea of the food famine versus the water famine. And then after that, we'll open out to questions from the audience.
Chinmay, thanks for your very good observations about the rainfall patterns, basically, etc., and how these have differed. Incidentally, I mentioned about 1972, and your graph is particularly mentioning 1972 because your data is very updated on that. The second point is about the inflationary trends and the pricing. And the third point, which you mentioned about the number of deaths which have occurred in different famines, etc. I'm pretty sure they would like to share his views on this. But this idea about a water famine is an excellent idea to be discussed, I think, particularly, etc. And I don't know whether I can chip in one more thing. During the 1870s, when India suffered, 1870s and 1880s, India had suffered series of famines across different parts of the country. And the railways had been brought in by that time. There was a very important railway tracks which were put on the what is known as the narrow gauge in India. And that is known as the famine railways, basically, which was set up in several parts of the country, basically. So I'm not pretty sure whether any one of us here, including Tim, would have any idea. Bengal is a region which suffered from famines for more than 2 centuries, actually, and there was any special famine railways being constructed over there as a part of servicing unreachable areas for storing of food grains. Because that is a very interesting aspect about how the British dealt with the famines in India and expansion of the railways into the hinterlands, basically. Tim, all yours.
You're on mute. Yeah. Sorry.
You have to unmute yourself, please.
Sorry, Chinmay, it was lovely to see you. That's what I said. Thanks very much for the comments. Well, you were talking about railways at the end, but I'll talk about railways at the beginning, and that is simply the paper by Robin Burgess and Dave Donaldson in the American Economic Review, published about 10 years ago. I think looking at the broad sweep of famine decline in general, it shows quite clearly that the extension of the railway network did have a major beneficial effect, along with other changes, of course, improvements in communication, relief policies, and data too, data being absolutely crucial. To just address in particular some of Chinmay's points, I agree to begin with that this idea that there's often no food availability declines has become the new conventional wisdom. And I think this is regrettable. I and others, because really in many respects, I'm just reflecting other people, I don't believe that fads were all of the answer, far from it, but they were there. That's the point in these 2 famines. That's the point. The point about water famines, I have read Tirthankar Roy's piece, and I think it's extremely useful. He's highlighting a point, and obviously, particularly in the context of cholera and dysentery, it's a fundamental point. So there were improvements over time. This was eventually paid attention to, that is improving access to water during times of famine. And but as I understand it, this improvement didn't come from the center. It didn't come from Calcutta or from Delhi. It came more from local administrations scattered throughout India and from the local observations of local administrators. Sure, you've shown, I think, quite clearly that there was relative stability in rainfall during the 1920s and 1930s. And it may well be, as you suggest, that buffer stocks were reduced partly as a result of that by the early 1940s. But a point I would, and going through this stuff yet again, a point I would underline here is that the population was growing in the 1920s and the 1930s as well. That's another part of this. We're dealing at the aggregate level for the country as a whole. We're dealing with a population growth rate of something like 1% per year during the 1920s and 1930s, which was certainly relatively fast. And that too would have been put pressure on the food situation, although of course it was also a very difficult economic time. And you also have the increase in the supply of food from Burma into India as a whole. It wasn't just Bengal that depended upon rice imports to some extent from Burma, but other areas of India as well. Although, of course, within India, places like central provinces, Punjab and so on, were themselves exporters of cereals to the rest of the country. Just to come back to Bengal specifically, if you haven't read it, have a look at the minute in the Famine Inquiry Commission's report, the minute that was insisted upon by Afzal Hussain. It's, my goodness, that man, it was put in a minute, but that minute in the Famine Inquiry Commission report report on Bengal is tremendous. A man who stood up for what he believed in. Absolutely tremendous. Bengal's population during the 1920s and certainly during the 1930s was growing at about 1.7, 1.8% per year. And again, as Hussain documents, that had implications for food stocks, and in particular this issue of carryover, which he, I think, quite rightly suggests is, there was no such thing as carryover, certainly by the early 1940s. Afzal Hussain, tremendous. Inflation in the early 1940s, I'm certainly not arguing that inflationary pressures in Bengal's economy didn't have a contribution to this famine. I'm sure that that was the case. You say that it was concentrated, the famine was concentrated in Bengal, and of course it was, although the food situation elsewhere in India was tight during the 1940s. But it was nevertheless concentrated in Bengal. But within Bengal, we have, this is our and my figure, we have as a central estimate, more than 2 million deaths, 2.1 million deaths, possibly more, in a population of approximately 60 million. So it was undoubtedly, without any doubt, a massive tragedy and a huge trauma in the population. And let me just finish in my rejoinder to these points. One of the things that I've, again, in going through things in greater detail, partly to knowing that I was going to respond to you and Giant, was the wider consequences the famine in Bengal had during the 1950s and 1960s. Now, those consequences were many, but they also operated directly through two of Giant's predecessors as census commissioners. In particular, R.A. Gopalswamy, who was census commissioner for the 1951 census, and then, of course, went on to Madras and Tamil Nadu and had a major impact in terms of family planning, essentially, and his propagation of various approaches to family planning in Madras. And the second is Ashok Mitra, who was an administrator in Bengal during the famine. He was quite rightly there's a lovely piece of his in EPW published about, I think, in the late 1980s. It's a personal recount of the famine. He was most very strongly critical of British administrators at higher levels, but he was also he also did not find, as an administrator, any spare supplies of reserve supplies of grain in Bengal during the famine when he was sent out to look for them. They didn't exist, if you like, in any substantial degree. And of course, Ashok Mitra went on to take the 1961 census. So I think, well, anyhow, I'll stop there.
Yeah, we'll open it up to questions. Anybody in the audience, you can either put it in the chat box or you can speak.
Yeah, Chinmay, thanks. I'll just make a small point which Tim mentioned about Dr. R. Gopalaswamy, the Secretary of the Famine Inquiry Commission, and then who was the 1951 Census Commissioner, and then subsequently the Chief Secretary of the Madras Presidency then. And he wrote in 1951 census a very important document, which Tim mentioned actually, improvident fertility. And not many people in India have read about that. And actually he is the person, I would give credit to the entire family planning movement in India, although the then Planning Commission obviously took up it in that sense, etc. But Mr. Gopalaswamy's contribution, other than the Famine Inquiry Commission, as the secretary of the committee over there, and then as the Census Commissioner, I think he had a vision about how fertility would be changing in India. And in this improvident fertility, in 1951, he's talking about average Indian women would be having around 4 children or something like that, which was unheard of sort of a thing. But we'll come back to this, more things on famine. And Tim, what would you say basically about the water famine which Chinmay has talked about, and the response to the food famine? There was a particular response. What about the water famine? Because in modern administration, and I've spent quite a bit of my time in Maharashtra, we have been extremely worried about the water famine in India. And not water famine for human beings, for water famine also for the cattle, for example. That's an important point. Maybe Chinmay may also have throw some light on this. And if any of the participants are there, as Chinmay has requested, you can put in your questions or observations, whatever you feel like, and we can continue to request him to respond, and maybe Chinmay as well. Yeah, Leela would like to, but Tim, would you like to say something on this?
No, I mean, there's relatively little that I can say about the water famine idea. I'm sure it was a very important component of the improvements which took place from early in the 20th century to later in the 20th century. So I have no doubt that it's a significant part of the jigsaw puzzle in explaining why the famine situation improved. And incidentally, I mean, what we're talking about there, to a large extent, or part of what we're talking about there is cholera, cholera as a problem, and it was undoubtedly a huge problem in many of the earlier famines. In looking at the Bengal famine and the Bangladesh famine in 1974-75, one of the changes which took place over time were significant improvements in dealing with malaria. Now, Bangladesh was not terribly badly affected by malaria, but it was affected by malaria. And so when you come through to the 1974-75 famine, you're looking at a different epidemiological context than was the case 30 or 40 years before. And so I think when you're looking at any food crisis famine situation, the overall epidemiological context is something that can change and can have an independent beneficial effect of itself that relates to water and cholera and related diseases, and it relates also to malaria. Of course, I don't think water was a really major problem in the 1943-44 famine. After all, Bangladesh and Bengal as a whole have their supply of water. But of course, if you look elsewhere in India, and if you look in Maharashtra, particularly areas, the districts behind the Western Ghats, then you're dealing with issues where lack of rainfall and very poor water supplies, wells that have no water in them, is absolutely crucial.
Yeah, Professor Leela Visaria.
Leela, Dr. Leela, you can unmute yourself and then raise the question. Yeah.
I agree. I think Bengal has perennial rivers which supplied water continuously for farming and for other uses. And so I think while Chinmay's point about water is very, very important at the national level, I do think that that was not the case with Bengal. But I think Tim and Chinmay may have looked at this issue in greater detail to be able to really, unpack this whole thing. Thank you.
Well, Tim, Leela is mentioning about the various rivers, Padma and Brahmaputra and everything pouring into the Bay of Bengal. And these are sort of fed from the Himalayas. So the availability of water is not a question over there. So what impact could have this led to improvement in maybe rice production or something like that at that period in time? Because I'm not very familiar with the irrigation canal systems over there. I'm very familiar with the irrigation canal systems in Punjab and the work related on that, but I'm not very familiar with the irrigation systems in Bengal for that matter, and East Bengal or Bangladesh now?
Yeah, well, I'm sure water was important even in the Bengali context in the terms of in terms of diseases. And I'm thinking about 1943-44. Cholera was undoubtedly a part of the mortality, although I think malaria was a larger part of the mortality. So water issues, in particular, in relation to good supplies of good water, probably was a significant part of the story. But the Bengal famine of 1942-43, and this is something, again, I'm drawing on the work of others, a key component of this famine was the failure of the main rice harvest at the end of 1942. And that, I think there is very strong reason to believe that a so-called brown spot, a disease, a fungal disease, which affected the rice crop, was very important, and it led to a major reduction in a huge, quite possibly, I better be careful, quite possibly a huge reduction. A man called, and I've got things written down here, a man who I had not heard of, but Binjay Ranjan Sen. He was involved in the relief operation in Bengal in 1942 and 1943. He went on to become Director General of the Food and Agricultural Organization and had a major impact on how FAO has developed over the decades. He described the rice crop, the Amman rice crop at the end of 1942 as being a total failure. And he was there, a total failure. Now, brown spot of rice, we may think of it as being, sort of just a disease, but it continues today to be a significant problem. Even Japan had a sharp reduction of rice in 1 year in the 1990s as a result of brown spot. And where does this information about brown spot of rice as it affected Bengal in 1942 in particular come from? It comes from a very distinguished Indian scientist, Y.S. Padmanabhan, who then went on to have a major impact upon our knowledge of rice and rice diseases. One of the points I make in the paper is that us academics, maybe not demographers so much, because we start with population and we go in all directions, but often academics work within their disciplinary boundaries, and therefore they miss things that are going on in other disciplines. S.Y. Padmanabhan's paper in 1973, which was published as a commemoration of the 1943 famine, appeared in the Annual Review of Phytopathology. And the Annual Review of Phytopathology is not part of my bedtime reading.
Thanks, Tim, for this. We have got Daniel looking for some clarification or question. Daniel, you can switch on and please raise your clarification or question.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Okay, thank you very much, Tim, for this great presentation. I'm so glad I found out yesterday about this session, and I got up at 4:30 in the morning here in Washington, D.C. I learned so much from your presentation and from the discussants. I don't really know very much about the South Asian context, but I'm really fascinated by your 5 explanations for trying to sort of analyze how these differences of opinion or differences of the stances people have taken have come about. Your idea that people sort of delight in debunking hypotheses that they don't like. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about the kind of anti-Malthusian perspective that you've noted in your paper. You cited the work of Amartya Sen several times in the paper, and there's actually this is bringing to mind a parallel debate in the China field about the impact of China's population or Malthusian controls on its birth rate decline. And there's also a kind of anti-Malthus perspective there. And Sen took the position that instead of distribution, substitute the word development. So the current wisdom in many quarters of the field is that China's birth rate decline was due more to development than the population control program. So there does seem to be a strong strain of anti-Malthusianism in the field. And it's not just in other quarters of the social sciences, but within demography itself, Malthus seems to be in the doghouse. Would you like to share some thoughts with us on that? Do you agree, disagree with anything I just said? Thank you.
Well, thanks for that, Daniel. I've been in the dining hall at Jesus College, Cambridge twice, and one of them was with Giant over there. I think it was in 1997. There's a painting on the wall of the dining hall of Malthus. It's the only portrait we have of him. In the social science, let me preface my response by saying that in going back through this work, what came to me was, while there were many factors involved in the two disasters that I focus upon, nevertheless, part of the background was population growth. The population growth would not have been a particular problem were it not for other things, particularly warfare and conflict and so on. But nevertheless, it was part of the background to these crises, and it tends to be downplayed. In the social sciences, I used to be in a Department of Development Studies, and there's no doubt that the term Malthusian, it's bounded around left, right, and center. It means very different things, but it's almost always used in a dismissive way.
Right.
And it's people believing things about Malthus that they like to believe, rather than actually what he wrote. Malthus's first essay, of course, which was published, I think, in 1798, was the writings of a young man who was having an argument with his father. And so he went rather over the top, if you like, in formulating it. But beginning with the second essay, which was published either in 1803 or 1804, Malthus's work becomes, even to this day, the most, arguably the most important treatise that there is about the relationship between populations, in many aspects of populations, and their environments and their food supplies. So I think that Malthus gets a very bad, an unduly bad press, let me put it that way. And it's very easy for social scientists to kind of just talk about, and be critical of Malthus, dub things as being Malthusian. Surely the world in which we live today, and again, I'm talking a little bit about this tomorrow, if you look at the last 70 years, in the last 70 years, there's been an increase in population. This is basically my lifetime, from 2.5 billion to 8 billion, and it's still growing. Population growth is part, not all, but it's part of the situation, the mess we find ourselves in today when we come to look at what we're doing to the global environment and the decades that go ahead. So I think that social scientists have a responsibility to look at population in a more cool way, if I could put it that way. I'm sorry, Daniel, that's a bit of an emotional reply to you. There's all sorts of aspects of Malthus that we could talk about. But it's interesting to hear what's happening in China.
Yeah, I can relate to the emotional response. Do you know of any essays or studies on this kind of anti-Malthus perspective which has taken hold? Has anybody collected different examples of this? Because I mean, it does seem surprising. I mean, Malthus is kind of everybody's great grandparent in the field. So, do you know of any essays on this?
No, the short answer is no, I don't. I think that one of my retorts to anyone who's critical of Malthus would be to look at the book by Tony Wrigley and others, The Population History of England. And in particular, because they've got data there for 300, 350 years. And what they see over the long run, having drawn on hundreds and hundreds of parish registers and so on, what they see over the long run is essentially the operation of the so-called nuptiality valve, the way in which marriage fluctuated, particularly the age of women and the amount of women's marriage that occurred over time, and the way in which it operated to in inverted commas, well, check or reduce, keep within bounds the rate of population growth. So that would be part of my retort. Another part of my retort would be to say to look at the second essay, or alternatively Malthus's summary view of population. And he wrote, by the way, very perceptively about parts of India. I'm not talking about in the first essay, but in subsequent versions of his essay. He didn't write a lot about India, but that he did write was very insightful. There's an interesting paper in PDR by Jack Caldwell, written maybe 20 years ago, on Malthus and Malthus in the context of India. It's well worth reading.
Good, thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. Tim, let us continue the conversation. We have time here. So, if I remember correctly, you're taught in Australia, you're taught in Beirut in the American University. And I was just thinking about Lebanon. Lebanon has obviously seen a lot of war, etc., continuously for several years, decades actually, etc. And any impact you remember, I mean, having spent a bit of your life in Beirut over there, about the implications of war with the availability of food as such? By the way, I just thought I would like to relate something where you spent your time teaching demography, among other things.
Are you talking to me?
Yeah.
Well, my limit, I mean, I don't want to exaggerate my work in Beirut. The general point I would take from what you're saying is the importance of conflict in the context of famines. Now, the great 19th century famines in India were largely unrelated to conflict. They occurred largely because of droughts of the kinds that we were talking about. But as time has gone by, so the contexts in which famines tend to take place have become largely, I would say nowadays, anyhow, largely conflict situations. And it's almost impossible to look at more contemporary crises without looking at circumstances of conflict. That related to Bengal in 1943-44. It related to Bangladesh in 1974-75 because of the War of Independence, particularly in the last 9 months of 1971, and the subsequent consequences. I fear, we'll have to see where the world goes, but as you probably know, the United Nations recently declared a climate-related famine, or maybe it was a climate change-related famine, or a global warming-related famine in the context of southern Madagascar. I think there could be changes in the climate system that have profound and global effects and are very, very quick. And one of them would be a shutdown in the thermohaline circulation patterns in the world's oceans. We know that such changes have occurred in the past, that they've been very sudden, and that they bring about essentially a sudden change in agricultural conditions or climate conditions everywhere, irrespective of where you are. So I fear, looking forward, that we may move to circumstances in which, in and of itself, once again, climate can become the cause of a famine, including declines in food availability. But in terms of the modern world, without any doubt, conflict has been a hugely important part of famines. And of course, the period of the Second World War brings or incorporates famines not only in Bengal, but in East Africa, in Southeast Asia, in Europe, and in much elsewhere in Asia, in Russia, for example. So the intimacy of conflict, warfare, and famine is certainly often in the modern world very close. Look at Yemen, parts of Somalia, parts of Kenya even, I understand, more recently. So it's something we should never forget.
Yeah, thanks for bringing in that aspects of conflict and food non-availability, I would say. So I don't know if Dr. Leela has still a question. Her hand is still up. Or Dr. Leela, do you have got anything?
I probably don't know how to remove.
Okay, Suja, it's fine. It's fine. That's fine, Leela. I hope you are keeping well. It's good
Yeah,
to
thanks.
hear you.
So do I.
Nice seeing you. Nice seeing you, Tim.
It's lovely to see you, Linda, except I'm not seeing you. But never mind, it's lovely to talk to you.
Okay. Anne has also got a hand up. I don't know if she is also controlling this, so I don't know if there's any message for us. Okay, if we can continue. Chinmay, you would like to take this conversation forward in some direction? Tim particularly mentioned about the nuptiality issues, and I find it very interesting how nuptialities are getting affected during famines, etc., or for that matter from similar pandemics, for example. But anyway.
Yeah, I mean, this is a very interesting. I've been looking a lot at 1918 and this 25-year period between 1918. I'd love to hear how Tim thinks about this. You're saying population growth is a key aspect of this period, 1921 to 1941. We know, mortality declines overall, famine, pandemic-related mortality, plague, cholera, kind of reduce intensity. Influenza itself kills off a lot of people who might have died off later in the 1920s and 30s. So there is this period of population growth, which is, I think, very central to what you're saying in this paper, of keeping of this relative demand-supply situation of food grain in the 1940s, especially in Bengal, and that for me, this particular point about this population growth itself in the 1920s and 30s is very interesting as to what happens in particular to fertility. So just since Mr. Jayant talked about nuptiality, I thought I'll focus on fertility. And what there's a draft by Dave Donaldson on 1918 pandemic, in which they point out that after the 1918 pandemic, yes, there's a drop in fertility in 1918 itself during the pandemic, but there's a very rapid catch up in the early 1920s in birth rates and a variety of things, which leads to actually, in some way, even it's kind of a pandemic effect where suddenly you get much more survival of children, precisely because a lot of people, a lot of women in particular, died in 1918. Who would have otherwise died of maternal mortality and all those other related issues in the 1920s or 1930s. So for me, that's an interesting aspect. That is 1920s and 1930s. There is I don't know what the fertility data shows. I think it's very, at least the general lines on birth rates for that period are flat at the all India level between 1920s and say 1950s. I think birth rates start falling maybe in South India in the 1950s. But in this period, population growth is essentially mortality decline. How do you see the famine? How do you see this playing into the famine itself? That is, in terms of who's dying in the famine, and what happens after the famine in terms of fertility again? Is there a dampening effect on fertility in Bengal? So my broader point is about what are we learning about fertility before the crisis, during the crisis, and after the crisis in Bengal in particular?
Well, I'm not sure I can really answer that question, partly because I haven't been looking in detail at the demography of these famines, although Arup and I did do that. And Arup in particular, an important point to make about that famine, the Bengal famine of 1943-44, is that a lot of additional data on the famine, both demographic and non-demographic, has become available since Sen wrote his book in 1980. A lot of extra information has become available. And it's that has helped us to reevaluate the famine in all sorts of respects, including the demographic respects. One of the points I make in the paper is that Sen sees mortality as continuing excess mortality after the Bengal famine is continuing essentially up until 1950. But that's based upon data actually produced in a census report written by Ashok Mitra. And apparently, I can't remember the precise details, but Ashok Mitra's name had to be on it because someone else felt it was related to just West Bengal, incidentally, but someone else was not entirely happy with it and therefore insisted that Mitra put his specific name to the report. Anyhow, the data in Ashok Mitra's report suggests that mortality continued, excess mortality continued in 1950, but that was not the case. Essentially, by 1945, certainly by 1946, mortality was below the pre-famine level. As regards the fertility effects of famines, I mean, again, I think this is a very interesting potential area for research. I looked at it years ago, but I didn't do any formal work on it. But looking at famines in general, I think it's quite interesting that in some famines, you get a fertility rebound, but in some other famines, you don't get a fertility rebound. And exactly why that difference exists, I'm not sure. I should say there that I'm not just thinking of famine data for India there, but famine data more generally. In the Chinese famine that Daniel was talking about, there was a substantial fertility rebound, as I recall, around about 1963 and 1964. I think that issue of the effects on fertility are really quite interesting. So far as India is concerned, and again, going back to what Chinmay raises about the 1920s and the 1930s, I don't think there's any doubt at all that although fertility may not have changed in the 1920s and 1930s, and indeed the 1940s, in some sections of the population, things were beginning to change. The elites in particular, in urban areas, perhaps particularly in Mumbai, particularly in Chennai, and some other areas in the south, and of course in pioneering work in what is today Karnataka and in Maharashtra, we have very important beginnings of a change of mind, if I could put it that way. So in that sense, I think mortality decline at that time did have an effect upon fertility, but of course it was going to take several decades before that change worked its way through.
I'll just last observation, when I was doing this work in 1918, last year in particular, I just found it striking that the region least affected by the influenza pandemic of 1918 was Eastern Bengal. which was the site of the next big disaster. And that's something which struck me as, if you think about, again, population growth, much of India got depopulated, so to speak, between 1911 and 1921. And the one place which did not was actually Bengal, because they kind of, and I would argue that they held out in the influenza pandemic because the drought really didn't hit them. I would say that the 1918 disaster was a combination of a drought and the pandemic, which led to this concentrated mortality in Western and Northern India. And I would differ slightly from Ian Mills' work on that. But Eastern India, Mills and whoever's worked on influenza, whether it's Chandra or my ongoing work, Eastern India was the least hit, which also means that the population growth which happened up from 1921 to 41 happened on a large kind of population to start with. There was no depopulation effect, in that decade. So in that sense, maybe the tension on food was arguably much more in Eastern India than maybe some parts. That's just a thought to kind of leave it, because I just found it really striking that the two big disasters in this 50-year period is 1918 and 1943. In 1918, Eastern India is virtually unhit, and in 1943, virtually rest of India is unhit. And so there's just a kind of pattern out here, which is interesting. Yeah.
Interesting.
All right, if we have come to the end of the session, Mr. Jain, do you want to add anything?
No, not really. I'm wondering if there's any other participant who would like to. Leela, you would like to say something? Not really. Okay. Okay. So Tim, on this note, what should I say? Well, thank you so much for writing this paper, and which you had written several years back. I'm so happy that you have brought it in an open discussion like this, which we do not normally have an opportunity to discuss. So I really appreciate this huge effort. Well, you have been at the center of several demographic debates, following the censuses, without the censuses. You will continue to do that. You continue to visit India. You continue to visit various institutes here. You talk to people. We had a common forum, was at the JNU 4 years ago, when we were discussing about the vital statistics and also on the causes of death and similar data. And well, both of us are so much interested both in the vital statistics and the cause of death data in any case. So looking forward in that case. But before we wind up, would you like to say something about your historical work, not along with Professor Visarias and Robert Kesson, but your more recent work? Maybe 2-3 minutes you would like to tell us about how do you look at India's demographic history 50,000 years ago? How it has evolved, and were there any references of ravine prior to the 16th or 17th century over there? Tim?
Well, thank you, Jayant. I mean, Chimney is an incredibly encouraging person, because he remains one of the very few people that are using these large sets of data and beginning, I suspect, to expand their use very considerably. Of course, Leela's here she is. I can't see her, but I can see her paper with Praveen's in the Cambridge Economic History of India. If there's one thing to read, I would point people to that. And I freely acknowledge, and acknowledged in the book, how much I owed to their work, and the work of a relatively small number of other people. I hope, and I remember Murray Butt. The last discussion I had with him was a lunch. We had lunch together, and how fervent he was that at IIPS, historical demography should receive greater attention than it was at the time. There are these huge bodies of data. Many of them are not only of massive historical significance for India, but also, as you, Giant, in your work on smallpox, it indicated of substantial scientific interest as well, and epidemiological interest. And so whether we deal with smallpox on the left-hand side of my screen, or whether we deal on the right-hand side of my screen with his recent book on migration, for example, there's massive, if I was, I would just be encouraging students everywhere to look at these data. A lot of them increasingly are online, although not the registration data, Giant. I think the huge number of reports, sanitary reports that there are, many of them at the provincial level. Chinmay, you're a young man, you've got dynamism. Get these damn things put online, because the potential, most people have concentrated on the census volumes because they are available in different locations, both within India and outside, but not the sanitary reports. And the sanitary reports really are incredibly important, as Giant will certainly agree. So anyhow, I thank both of you, and I thank very much all the other comments that have been made. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. I'm just going to add on this point on historical demography. There's a PhD student at IPS, Nelson Soy, who's just finishing up. So he's also a historical demography buff, and he's been working on nuptiality data, parish records, and so on. At the onset of the pandemic in March, I was outside South Park Street Cemetery in Kolkata, and I managed to pull out, their burial record book, got that digitized, and in this working paper of mine, you have a nice time series, 1800, probably the earliest time series of deaths in any burial ground in India. There is, Tim, a plan to put a lot of this data online. This is mostly coming from the community of economic historians. Unfortunately, not enough demographers who are interested. But I think, we've been hosting at IIM Ahmedabad. We've had 2 conferences so far. It's a conference on economic and business history, but we give space to demography people as well. And we have a PhD student workshop. So I welcome, if you know people, every 2 years we have this conference at IIMA, and we'll be more than happy to host people interested in historical demography out here. And at IIMA also, we have a history internship. Nelson, who was a PhD student at IPS, came here, spent 2 months, looked at these old records. So there is something in the air, and we all remember your call to arms for historical demography. And so definitely the arms are coming up slow and steadily, hopefully in the 2020s going forward. Yeah.
Thanks, Chinmay. Let me say, when I was doing my work on smallpox, I realized that there could be data for Calcutta from 1805. Mumbai and Calcutta had special posts for the superintendent of police then, who were in charge of the crematoriums, among other things, etc. And Mumbai, in any case, to my understanding, is possibly the only Asian city, I'm using the word Asian city, which has got an unbroken record on at least the death part from 1848. Okay, and I use that data in my work in smallpox in any case. So that's very commendable. Tokyo started, if I remember correctly, around 1870s or something like that, when I was looking at other parts of Asia. But anyway, as Tim says, when you start looking at historical demography, it makes us look younger and younger. In some sense, we are more encouraged to work. Well, I think it's time to say goodbye to Tim, goodbye to Chinmay. Thanks to the organizers, thanks to the secretariat, and thanks to the audience. Tim, well, really, we appreciate, and I really enjoyed your voice, your discussion, and obviously the contents of the paper. Looking forward to see you again, and Chinmay will get in touch. We are here in any case.
Thank you. Thanks. Thanks a lot, Tim.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, Daniel.
Thanks,
Daniel. Thanks. Professor Visaria, Professor Lina.